Scale practice sounds dry and boring, and more than anything else about moving your fingers on the instrument in a way that is anything but music. But when you practice exercises like scale exercises, and the goal is to make it easier for you to play the things that you want to play in your solos. It is really that simple, and keeping that in mind will help you come up with a lot of exercises that are much more efficient in making you play better. Let's take a look at what exercises you should be working on, but also how you should play them and think about them, which is probably different from what you might expect. With any scale that you want to practice, then you of course want to start with the most basic exercise, just playing the scale. Probably not a surprise there. You can practice scales in many ways, in a position, on a single string or across the neck. To begin with, it makes a lot of sense to stick with positions, especially if you want to play a song with chord progressions that require you to use different scales. Focus on learning how to play the scale, what notes are in there, and how it looks on the fretboard in that position. When you solo, then you're not just running up and down the scale. That sounds pretty boring. You want to be able to create lines like this. And in this solo there are a lot of 7th chord arpeggios and triads, so it only makes sense that if you want to use those structures in your solos, then you also want to practice them in your scales. That's also why I made a video on the most important scale exercise in jazz, which is practicing diatonic 7th chord arpeggios. The reason that is so important is that the basic chords that you improvise over in jazz are 7th chords, and this exercise is how you connect the scale to the harmony of the song. This is how you get into the stuff that you want to use. First you want to learn the basic arpeggios, and later in the video I'm going to show you some ways that you can expand those exercises so that they actually just become small licks that you can use in your solos. This exercise can be a little bit tricky to play if you've never tried it before, but there's a really useful hack to help you get into it. Each 7th chord arpeggio is a stack of thirds in the scale, and instead of playing the entire 7th chord arpeggio right away, then you can ease into it by first practicing the diatonic thirds, then turn those into diatonic triads, and then move on into the diatonic 7th chords. The diatonic thirds are a great exercise for flexibility in your playing, and for the rest very much a technical exercise, but as you can see also a very important building block. The diatonic triads are useful in solos, and you'll see later how they are really worthwhile exploring and something that you can put to use in many different ways. This also shows you why the third interval is so incredibly important as a scale exercise. As you saw both in the first West solo, or will find if you check out other Bob solos, then the arpeggios and triads are played in specific ways in the solo, and you might as well incorporate that into how you practice the arpeggios through the scale. In that way you're just turning a scale exercise into a flexible lick that you can insert directly into your own solo. The most important version of this is probably using the 8th note triplet with the leading note. This exercise is helping you add variation to the rhythm in your solo, and also teaching you how to use chromatic passing notes in your lines. And it is all over any bebop solo that you check out. Another great way to use triplets is to use them to resolve the top note of the arpeggio, like this. This way of playing the arpeggio lends itself really well to help you keep the changes moving in a line. For example, a 2-5-1 like this one. This is such a strong melodic idea that a triad version of this is also worthwhile checking out, and actually a shortcut to some West licks. You start with the basic exercise, and taking this to the scale also becomes a great phrasing exercise. And you may also recognize this phrase as a lick that Wes is using in his solo on 4 and 6 on the Smoking at the Half Note album. In general, it can be very useful to experiment with using fragments of licks that you transcribed as scale exercises. and in that way both play them better and hear them move through the scale. Now you may be thinking that this is a very complicated thing to do, keep track of what notes and arpeggios that you have to take through the scale, but that's actually not how you want to approach it. When you're practicing exercises like this, then you can't rely on analyzing everything. That's a separate skill and something you need to build in other ways. Instead, you should look at the exercise as a short, predictable melody that you take through the scale and try to hear your way through it. Again, starting with this may seem difficult, but if you start with the third intervals, build it to the triads, then you get used to how it works and you'll find that it's actually not as difficult as you might think. With exercises like these, then it really pays off to worry more about precision and clean execution than speed. This is simply because if you can easily play them cleanly at a slower tempo, then speeding them up will become easier. You'll probably also realize that if you speed it up before having the control, then you're going to have to go back and fix things later, and at that time you may also have developed some bad habits. As I mentioned earlier, then it is useful to take fragments from the solos of the people that you transcribe and listen to and turn those into exercises. An amazing resource for this that you can get a lot of inspiration from is this Joe Pass book, which has some rock solid bebop lines that you definitely want to have in your vocabulary, and I'll give you thousands of ideas for new exercises and lines to work on.